Welcome to episode 49 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
How you doing, Kevin?
Not too bad. Yourself?
Not bad.
As we tackle a different featured topic each episode, new ones are normally out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. Please do rate and review us and drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening, and now it's time to introduce our featured topic and our guest for this episode.
With the ever-increasing threat of ransomware, and stay tuned for a headline segment later to hear the latest one, organizations have increasingly turned to cyber insurance as an added layer of protection against paying a hefty sum to hackers when they're attacked. But is cyber insurance worth it, and is it working?
A research paper by our guest this episode and his colleagues for the UK's Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, examines those questions as well as how cyber insurance could work better to incentivize improved cybersecurity among clients. To discuss the paper titled Cyber Insurance and the Cybersecurity Challenge, we welcome cyber research analyst Jamie McCall. Jamie, thanks very much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
First off, for those who may be a little less familiar with the whole industry, what exactly is cyber insurance?
So cyber insurance is, when it works properly, it's a way to transfer your cyber risk, essentially, and to get access to financial coverage that covers the costs of an incident. And because the industry at the moment is not standardized and coverage is not standardized, that coverage could include and exclude a number of different types of incident. And for instance, if we're going to talk about ransomware, some coverage won't include ransomware, for instance. But where the cyber insurance industry is different to most other types of insurance, bar maybe something like kidnap and ransom, where there's a similar element, cyber insurance also increasingly includes access to services rather than just financial coverage. To date, that's mostly included services that focus on recovering from an incident or responding to an incident. So that can include access to incident response or to PR or to legal advice. But increasingly, some of the more kind of innovative insurers, so in the US, companies like Resilience or Coalition, or in the UK, CFC Underwriting, they provide sort of I guess we call them like preventative services. So things like, and this is included as part of the coverage, things like, I don't know, phishing training or access to a virtual CISO for small to medium enterprises. So that kind of marks it out as different to most other types of insurance.
And before we keep the focus completely on ransomware here, because I think that's what most people associate cyber insurance with, what are some other types of incident responses that cyber insurance handles, really?
Yeah, so I guess the sort of standard data breaches. I think from my understanding, it doesn't necessarily have to just cover kind of malicious activity. So I think it can cover accidental losses as well. You know, for if an employee misconfigures something and then there's a major incident as a consequence. But so yeah, you can get coverage for most types of incident that you can think of, but unless it's a sort of standardized generic policy, particularly for a larger business, you'll have to sort of go into the weeds and the details of negotiating what it covers.
Right. And, you know, on face value, this seems like a pretty good idea. If you have a value or an asset with a value and you want to protect it, getting insurance sounds pretty straightforward for it. But your paper goes into this debate of how much harm versus how much good the industry is doing. Does that just kind of come down to regulation at this point because it's such a new and budding industry?
Yeah, so it is and it isn't new. I mean, in the grand scheme of insurance, it's new. I mean, insurance has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, property insurance came out of the Great Fire of London in 1667. I should know that because I live around the corner from where it started. So in that context, yes, cyber insurance is very, very new. But I mean, in the US, it's been around for more than 20 years now. And for its proponents, the argument has long been the industry just needs to mature. We need to reach a certain point of kind of market saturation so that we can then focus on, being much tougher in our underwriting and asking for more stringent controls. Because to date, or at least until the last 18 months, the focus has just been on let's grow, let's get as many customers as possible, let's, lower the kind of controls and standards that we're asking for coverage because we just need to compete. We need to get as many customers as possible. But I wouldn't say it's unregulated. In the UK, the insurance industry is one of the most regulated sectors as part of the financial services sector. I think to date, the issue has more just been that it's been pretty profitable for the cyber insurance industry, cyber insurance, until the really significant losses that we've seen over the last 18 months. And that's really been driven by ransomware. I think most insurers have been willing to take on quite high levels of risk, but we are seeing that changing. And in theory, I think that the idea is that insurers are now going to kind of be much more stringent in their underwriting and say, you have to have multi-factor authentication in place. You have to have this firewall in place or you're not going to get coverage. So it'll be interesting to see what happens now.
The elephant in the room is this real explosion in ransomware over the last, as you say, 18 months or so. And I think what a lot of people's maybe first exposure to cyber insurance has been is seeing that, this company has cyber insurance and the insurance will pay out the ransom and get them back online. So is that a thing that does happen quite a bit? And then secondarily, is that putting a target on some of these companies' backs, knowing that hackers are able to find out whether maybe they're a client of an insurer?
Yeah. I mean, prior to working at RUSI, I used to work in cyber threat intelligence. And certainly my perspective on cyber insurance coming from that background is quite negative, the reasons that you outline. I think there's quite a almost sort of adversarial relationship between cybersecurity practitioners and the cyber insurance industry. And I think that's partly because we're competing for the same amount of resources in some sense. And that it's certainly true that there are some boards that will say why, and I don't think this happens as commonly as we might think, but there are going to be some senior level board members that are going to say, why should we spend money on cybersecurity when we can spend money on cyber insurance, and that will just give us the kind of backstop that we need if there is an incident. Although I don't think that happens very often. But also, it's because there is this widespread perception that cyber insurance is, actively fueling the ransomware epidemic. But I think, and everyone has anecdotal evidence about during the sort of incident response phase, an insurer saying, or encouraging a policyholder to pay a ransom rather than pay for the costs of recovery. And I've certainly heard those anecdotes as well. But I still don't think there's kind of strong evidence either way that that's the case. And I think that highlights one of the major problems with ransomware, right? That there isn't mandatory reporting around attacks. There's very little transparency about the decision-making process that happens when victims are choosing to pay the ransom or to pay for recovery. So I mean, not to talk down our paper, but I do think there is more kind of research needed in that area. My instinct is that insurers don't want to have to make this decision themselves. Insurers don't come up with public policy. And insurers, in the same way as a lot of victims, have kind of been left to themselves by governments to figure this out themselves. I mean, ransomware is like, in my opinion at least, is like a national security threat now. That's a threat to our kind of economic and societal resilience. And that should be reflected at the response in government. But still today, government has basically just said, unless it's a critical national infrastructure provider, this is up to the private sector to figure out for itself. And I think insurers have kind of suffered the consequences of that as well. But I think it's interesting, over the last couple of weeks in the US, you've seen some CEOs or senior decision makers at insurers saying we would support government banning ransom payments because it's got out of control for them. And I think they're looking for any kind of solution that's going to try and limit the number of attacks.
Interesting topic you foray into when you start getting the government involved. And, you have this question of how much regulation versus, how much you need to get involved with the private workings of an institution or a corporation out there. But as you said, there seems to be this growing appetite for policy to actually sort of bridge the gap. Is there anything on the insurer's side that they can do to help improve things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the recommendations we make is that I guess there's sort of two things. There's two parts of the ransomware kind of attack chain that they can become involved in helping to stop. So I guess there's mitigating the attacks in the first place. And certainly we would support essentially all insurers coming together and saying a policyholder will not get, they can have cyber insurance, but they will not get ransomware coverage as part of that insurance unless they have these sets of controls in place that we know will at least reduce the likelihood of a ransomware attack. And we can talk about the sort of the best practices that we think work in that camp, whether it's, doing the basics like configuring Office 365 properly or enabling multi-factor authentication, so kind of network segmentation. So if that's the sort of prevention phase, then we believe that there's also more that they can offer in helping to kind of track and disrupt the criminals themselves. And I think arguably more than some threat intelligence providers or cybersecurity companies, I mean, insurers have a lot of data on the groups, what their tactics are for negotiating their cryptocurrency wallets, and therefore they could potentially be useful in tracing those wallets and the gangs themselves. And I think that's a kind of source of intelligence that hasn't really been properly utilized by law enforcement or intelligence agencies yet. So I think there's definitely more that can be done on that front.
Yeah, the idea of more transparency around when somebody's been breached and how the process plays out. It still seems there is sort of a knee jerk by a lot of companies and organizations if they are a victim to try and sweep it under the rug and pretend that it didn't happen publicly. But that usually seems to backfire anyway. So really maybe mandating a little bit more reporting and sharing of information could help.
Yeah, I think certainly, we do have mandatory reporting in the UK as part of GDPR, but for the most part, that only involves attacks which affect the confidentiality of data rather than the availability. And obviously that increasingly does include some ransomware attacks because lots of them steal as well as encrypt data or even just steal data. But it's not, the reporting of that is not happening it doesn't equate to the number of attacks we think are happening still.
Mm-hmm. And in the US, there's sort of movement in that direction, but not the same level of, even requirement of reporting as of yet.
Yeah. And my understanding kind of looking at the US is that there's a lot more happening at the sort of state level and the federal level at the moment. And to me, that reflects the fact that the government still isn't taking it seriously enough. I mean, it's great that state governments are thinking about it, but I don't think that kind of stacks up to the seriousness of the threat.
Yeah.
But then again, I'm a big government European, so that might just reflect my perspective on that as well.
I know at the federal level, there has been some legislation sort of bandied about more lately. And I think, as you see, as you talked about, some of these attacks are starting to even get into infrastructure adjacent areas that may start to get the ball rolling even a little bit more.
You'd think so, but there have been so many attacks on hospitals and healthcare providers over the last couple of years, and that hasn't spurred that much movement yet. I guess it's only really Colonial that seems to have really, and in Europe, I guess the attack against the Irish healthcare system, where that seems to have really tipped it over the edge.
Yeah, governments move slow and take a lot of prodding to get anything done.
I think another angle that we've touched on a little bit here already, but you mentioned in the research paper, the cyber insurance industry has not really done the either carrots or stick approach, where either, offering incentives to lower premiums related to being more cyber secure or mandating certain levels of cybersecurity. So even in doing the research and since publishing this, are you seeing maybe a little bit more movement in that direction then?
Yeah, there's definitely more, at least anecdotally, you see these sort of surveys of insurance brokers, and there it does seem to be the case that insurers are either kind of reducing capacity. So if you're a high risk organization, you just can't find coverage, or they're saying, yes, you have to have, this cybersecurity standard in place, whether it's, NIST or ISO 27001, or, you have to have this set of controls that we've identified based on our historic claims data. The problem with that is that, and this is a problem with cybersecurity and cyber risk generally, I think a lot of insurers still don't feel that they have a firm handle on what actually drives risk. So to some extent, it's still kind of a shot in the dark and a hope that those are the controls that work. But, because we know threat actors, because the risk is dynamic and, the threat, unlike other forms of insurance like, hurricane or floods, the threat is dynamic, it's human, and it's going to react to what you're doing. And insurance still moves in relatively slow cycles, right? It's an annual renewal, although some of the more innovative insurers are kind of offering like daily threat updates, but it's still... It's hard for insurers to say this set of controls is going to reduce this organization's risk, and therefore we're going to offer them this reduced premium. And the other issue is that for most organizations, if you're an SME, a small to medium enterprise, and an insurer comes to you and says, you need to do this set of controls, say, you need to implement network segmentation tactics, then that is going to be enormously expensive to you if you're not already doing it. And the cost of doing that is going to far outweigh any reduced premium you get. So unless it's an organization that is very aware of their risk or willing to spend money, the carrots that insurers are able to offer them are probably currently not tasty enough. It's not a very good metaphor for them to, for a policyholder to want to do it.
So hypothetically, let's say these public-private partnerships don't really manifest and the policy angle doesn't really come through, and ransomware keeps trending the way it has. 5 to 10 years from now, is cyber insurance still a viable business model?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yes, but potentially without ransomware coverage. But whether businesses want insurance that doesn't include ransomware coverage is another question. I think a major problem at the moment is insurers and reinsurers are just not able to attract a lot of capital to the market to support their growth from banks and from other providers of capital. And I think a lot of that is just because it's so hard to model and predict the risk. I think a lot of big businesses are starting to self-insure or band together as a small group and sort of collectively insure rather than going through an insurer, because it's just becoming really hard for them to find the kind of level of financial coverage that they find attractive. And I think because of that, I think the cyber insurance market could increasingly become like a sort of a market that primarily covers kind of small to medium businesses. But I think, as a sort of outside observer that doesn't necessarily have a dog in the fight, I think it's a very interesting time to see what happens to it. And I think the next couple of years are going to be really crucial.
Yeah. And if they ban ransomware payments, for instance, from cyber insurers, where does that lead the ransomware actors and all that as well? There are a lot of implications there.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a bit of a misconception that insurers naturally want to pay the ransom instead of recovery. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that, as I said earlier, you have seen a lot of insurers starting to publicly call on the government to ban ransom payments. The problem is that I think there are so many good arguments kind of for and against banning ransom payments. I personally think on the basis of current evidence that unless the government is prepared to provide kind of significant financial resources for victims and more protection to stop them being targeted in the first place, I think it's kind of unfair to say to victims of a crime that you can't try and resolve it as quickly as possible. Having said that, I think there needs to be much more messaging around the fact that, paying the ransom often doesn't resolve the crime and it doesn't necessarily stop it from happening to you again. But that's potentially a kind of a different issue.
Yeah, a lot of depth to continue to go into here. And we've just kind of scratched the surface of the research paper. Where can people find more information about this and maybe take a look at the paper themselves?
So it's on the RUSI website. If you just Google the cyber insurance and the cybersecurity challenge. Hopefully it will come up or we're doing something wrong. And we're also continuing the research for another year and funded by the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, and looking kind of in more depth at the relationship between cyber insurance and ransomware. So that if there's anyone listening that is interested in that and would be interested in being part of the research, then please get in touch.
Great. And we'll have the link to the paper in the description as well, just in case, the Google doesn't do its job there. Thanks, Jamie, very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at the top stories in the cybersecurity world and talk about what they may mean to you. Now, headline number 1. Up to 1,500 businesses affected by ransomware attack, U.S. firm's CEO says. So between 800 and 1,500 businesses around the world may have been affected by a ransomware attack centered on Florida-based information technology firm Kaseya, its chief executive said. That's a pretty massive ransomware attack.
Yes, I do believe the largest ransomware attack in history to date is, as it's been reported, pretty strangely, though, because I haven't seen too much of this in the news or really seen too much buzz about it, likely because of the timing right in front of the July 4th weekend. So lots of people out on a long weekend, and maybe these businesses impacted see a slightly less of a negative impact than they would.
And maybe they're just coming back from the weekend as we record this and discovering that things are not so great after all. But the CEO, Fred Vacola, said in an interview, the CEO of Kaseya, that is, that it was hard to estimate the precise impact of the attack because those hit were mainly customers of Kaseya's customers, so not their direct customers. And they're a company that provides software tools to IT outsourcing shops, companies that typically handle back office work for companies too small or modestly resourced to have their own tech departments. So that does make it a lot trickier to figure out exactly who all got hurt by this issue.
Right, and that also sort of explains, the breadth and depth of this attack, as well as sort of, I guess, the lack of a huge response to it, is that it is quite a few businesses out there, but as Vacola said, these tend to be, dental offices and supermarkets. This isn't any critical U.S. infrastructure. Nobody's taking the power grid offline. So
right,
it's a big hack, but it's not exactly shutting down the nation.
But the bigness of this hack is leading to a ransom demand of $70 million. So that's a pretty big one. I'm not sure if the demand is directly of Kaseya to pay the $70 million, or if they're trying to spread it around and it's all added up somehow.
Yeah, I was a little confused on that. Is this like a collective demand that they've sent out to all these different people, or as you said, they sent this to Kaseya and are hoping to get it from them? So as far as what Kaseya has done in response, there has been a very hard no comment given there. So actually, interesting quote. He said, "No comment on anything to do with negotiating with terrorists in any way." So we can kind of see that language change that we've been hinting at over the last several episodes.
That's right. Yeah. It just keeps building up, and we're seeing it shifting as we're talking about it. But the Reuters story that we are working off of, they actually did speak with a representative of the hackers, and they said that they are always ready to negotiate. So maybe they could bring that $70 million down just a skosh.
Always start high.
Yeah. Doesn't hurt to ask, right? They can only say no. But so this is affecting companies in 12 countries at least. The story, interestingly, says all 5 continents, which we discussed a little bit already. At first, I was
it didn't quite add up, but...
Yeah, at first I thought maybe it's been a while since I've been in school. Maybe they removed a continent. They said something wasn't big enough to be a continent anymore or something. But it looks like Australia and Antarctica are the ones that have not been not had a country affected by this.
Yeah, Antarctica, I understand, but the Australia one, the story itself mentions that 11 schools in New Zealand were affected by this hack, which I would pair with the Australian continent myself. But maybe I need to go do some more geographic demographic research, and maybe some things have changed.
Yeah, we still think of you as a continent, Australia. We take that position. So.
You're a continent to us.
Yes. Yeah, so Sweden is the other place where there is a big impact. So the New Zealand schools are one of the big ones here. The other one was a grocery store chain in Sweden that basically had to shut down hundreds of locations because their cash registers were inoperative. And then in New Zealand, 11 schools and several kindergartens were affected as well. So in the conversation, the hacker was like, we didn't mean to do that to the schools. That was an accident. But they didn't care about the supermarkets.
Yeah, supermarkets, whatever.
Nothing more than a business,
right?
The representative said. Going back to what you were saying, there's no critical infrastructure that we know of involved. So the White House is sort of just making sure there's no national security risk posed by this particular issue. If there isn't, it looks like they're just going to let this one play out. However, the company and the ransomware cell decides to let this one play out.
Right. So maybe this story will come and go pretty quickly. There is one bit of suspicion hanging out there, I guess it is, and that this firm was in the process of fixing the very vulnerability that was exploited. So potentially somebody somewhere knew about either this being fixed or this being a vulnerability on one side or the other, and somebody decided to act before it could get fixed. So Mr. Vicola says, of course, that they don't believe anybody was in their network and it's just sort of coincidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he denies any sort of internal subterfuge, but that is quite the coincidence, and especially with such a wide-reaching breach and attack, it does make you wonder.
Right.
Now, headline number 2. Google removes popular Android apps that stole Facebook passwords. So Google is still in the process of pulling Android apps as we record this that commit major privacy violations. And in this particular story, we're talking about 9 apps from the Play Store that security firm Dr. Web found were using Trojans to steal Facebook login details. And the malware had over 5.8 million combined downloads on the Play Store. So that's a pretty substantial issue as well.
Right, yeah. First and foremost, I love the name Dr. Web. That's a great name. But yeah, 5.8 million downloads. That tells me that these have likely been on the store for quite a while and ranked pretty well. I would assume they need reviews and star ratings to get that kind of visibility. So I'm not sure what the background was to get these up on that front page of the App Store, but, you know, obviously somebody had to move them to that top 10 spot to get views.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at some point, there are obviously people who just find an app and download it with no background on it, which seems insane to me. But but people do that. But when you get to this level, yeah, you're getting mainstream folks going through and like, oh, a bunch of people downloaded this horoscope app. Then I'll get on that and see what's going to happen to me next month.
And that was sort of the shade of types of apps that were targeted here. Horoscope, things like junkware removal type apps. There's some exercise and picture editing, that kind of thing. So they were pretty easy to find, pretty commonly searched type apps out there.
Yeah, and the interesting piece of this too is that they functioned as apps. Like if somebody downloaded it, they would actually be able to use the app for what it said. So that certainly makes it a little tougher to tell that you're putting yourself in danger. But the way that they were getting people's Facebook logins was to say that they would be able to disable in-app ads if they logged into their Facebook accounts. Then the app would load the real Facebook sign-in page, only to load JavaScript from a command and control server to hijack those credentials and pass them along to the app and back to the bad guys instead.
Right, and in each case, at least each case noted here, Facebook was the target, so we don't really see any Google sign-ins or anything like that. Yeah. But it seems like these creators could have just as easily steered people towards those if they were wanted to. And who knows, maybe those are still out there lurking and targeting those other types of platforms.
And with Facebook credentials, we know that people like to use their same logins everywhere.
That's true.
You get people's email accounts by getting their Facebook credentials, and then if you get their passwords, then you can do a pretty good amount of damage just by getting somebody's Facebook login. So you can see this ballooning beyond just being able to hack into someone's Facebook page and send out some phony friend requests, which is something you always see from some of your Facebook friends.
Yeah, where they have one photo and nothing ever posted. I always wondered who's following for those, but somebody out there is.
Somebody is, yeah.
So Google did tell Ars Technica that it banned all of the app developers from the store, which might not be much of a deterrent because they can just create new accounts for free and start over again.
Yeah, right. So the apps, just for those who may be wondering if you might still have one on your phone or something like that you might want to be a little careful about, it's Pip Photo, Processing Photo, Rubbish Cleaner, InWell Fitness, Horoscope Daily, App Lock Keep, Locket Master, Horoscope Pi, and App Lock Manager. And I actually there was one comment on this particular story, and I thought it was an interesting point because there is a difference between the Apple App Store and the Play Store on the Android side of things. And what did this comment kind of get at?
I'll just go ahead and read it out here for you. This comment by Mr. Greshnab, which is, I assume, a fake name. This helps emphasize the hypocrisy of the media. They get mad at Apple for over-controlling the developers in their app store and mandating that they review all code. Then they get mad at Google for not catching malware because they don't control app developers enough and don't require a code review. Either app stores are a cheap-to-run Wild West where there is malware and you know it, or it is a safe haven but expensive to maintain. You cannot have both cheap and safe.
Yeah, so it is interesting. I don't know if I would pin it on the quote-unquote hypocrisy of the media, but it is interesting to think about the philosophies of both places and see where there are some dangers. Obviously, the App Store has had some issues here and there as well, but far fewer.
Yeah, and as it stands now, a lot of the Google Play Store code reviewing process is all pretty automated, low touch, so much easier to slide things in like this, whereas on the Apple side, you've got to review your code, and there's an entire expensive team, like he said, in the background doing all that reviewing. So two different approaches here.
So if you're an Android user, just be a little bit careful about the apps that you download and maybe double verify the sources, and if you're not sure, maybe just leave them alone. Now, headline number 3. Cybersecurity workers flood Twitter with bikini pics to protest harassment. So a woman who works in cybersecurity was headed to the beach and posted a selfie on Twitter wearing a bikini. When she woke up hours later after not checking for a while, she saw someone was complaining about her posting a picture in, quote, underwear, even though her bio says she works in infosec, suggesting that what she did is unprofessional. And that led to a interesting development.
Right, so her response went viral, and a lot of people began sort of piling on with support by posting pictures of their own in bikinis, or for men who would be a little less comfortable in bikinis, just posting shirtless pictures in a show of solidarity.
Yeah, so the hashtag was infosecbikini. And for the most part, if you look through the hashtag on Twitter, very positive, supportive response to the initial poster and less kind to the strange reactionary post of a complaint of someone in a bikini in their Twitter feed.
Right, and this is kind of a look behind the curtain at sort of the culture behind network security. And so there's been these talks of how the social justice warriors out there being accused of shutting down conferences and sort of shutting down conversations on social media. I guess Twitter's kind of the poster child for that culture, but it's sort of rubbing people the wrong way, I guess. You're starting to see this response where people are saying, we have a life outside of work. We're not just here to spit out content on cybersecurity and go back to our closet to stand until tomorrow.
Yeah, and I mean, we've had, I think it was around a year ago, where we spoke with some folks regarding the issue of women being underrepresented in cybersecurity, and the fact that they're underrepresented in the industry may be partly due to the fact that they don't feel welcome by the sort of male-dominated industry, and maybe people are trying to keep them from feeling welcome, and it's a vicious cycle here.
Right. So Rick Ferguson, the VP of Security Research at Trend Micro, called this what I think is exactly what it is just people trying to act as gatekeepers, which seems a little counterintuitive for an industry that pretty regularly complains about not having enough talent and interest from people. So I guess it's one of those situations where if you want to have a larger, wider community, you're going to have to be inclusive of people joining that community.
Yeah, so the user who posted the bikini pic initially is Colleen S., and she said in an online chat that after her tweet, she received some terrible comments and unsolicited direct messages over it, but also much, much more in the way of support. She said, it's really awesome how supportive the community has been through all of this, and it gives me hope for our industry, which is rife with issues. So, it's one of those where sometimes the negative people can sort of expose the positive a little bit more. Maybe people would have been quietly supportive of women in cyber, and maybe they were just staying quiet, but maybe something like this sort of pushes that support more to the forefront and hopefully makes more people feel welcome to join the club and make it not so exclusive.
Yeah, and for the original commenter out there who took issue with this, I guess my concern is if what you're looking for in a social media platform is buttoned up professionalism, maybe Twitter's not the right choice for you. Maybe looked into LinkedIn. Twitter can get a little wild.
Yeah, that's kind of the point.
Right, and if you're not prepared for that, then you might be in the wrong place.
Yeah, just imagine this person getting offended by just about anything that they see, because I doubt that her bikini pic was the first time he saw something that would have gotten his blood going. Did not research the account more to see what other replies he had, but just imagine that there's some serious anger and reactionism there.
Right, and just a reminder that you follow people willingly and voluntarily on Twitter, so you are always able to opt out of that content if you disagree with it.
Yes, and the end of her post in response to him had the hashtag unfollow. So,
right, there you go.
That's all you got to do. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, and thanks very much to Jamie McCall for joining us. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now however you listen to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available, and please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs, and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode, but in the meantime, we remind you to get secure, stay secure.